Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. On today's episode of Chain Reaction, we talk with Mike Benitez, a U.S. military officer and creator of The Merge, a defense newsletter, about the challenges of finding mobile rockets and what we can learn from the recent conflict between the Israelis and Hamas in Gaza. Enjoy the show. Mike, it's good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm glad to be here. I just want to just throw out there that the things we'll talk about, my views and opinions, do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. And so with that out of the way, I'm happy to chat.
Yeah, so it's just our opinions and chatting about something that I've been curious about, with the recent flare-up in Israel and Palestine, with the war in Gaza, or at least the air war in Gaza. There's been a lot of focus on Iron Dome and the Israeli defense against Hamas rockets. But I wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about the challenges inherent, the challenges that these rockets pose to military. So wanted to get your first opinion, or at least hoping you ask for the first question, is just the basic challenge of finding mobile rocket launchers in an urban environment. This is not an easy task, and we always see the pictures of Iron Dome interceptors, but not the front end stuff. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Absolutely. So actually, it's not one problem; it's two problems. And so you have to break those problems down. The first one is, how do you find the mobile rocket launchers, and then the second one is, how do you actually do it in an urban environment? And so let's put those two problem sets one at a time. And so the first one is the mobile rocket launchers. So from what I've seen, there's basically two types that have been used in the recent attacks, and they're completely opposite. So one end of the spectrum are these crude steel I-beam TPs. They have hand-carried rockets. They lean on them and they shoot them off. And on the other end of the spectrum is what I would say what's more conventional military-looking equipment. So the 4-pack, 6-packs of rocket canisters. And it's important to know that they're not all the same, because they have different signatures, different movement characteristics, and the manpower, the people required to move them around and set them up is completely different. So the signature looks different. But no matter what, finding them preemptively is extremely difficult, because regardless of the system, they're small, they're extremely mobile, they have no electronic signature in most cases, and the physical signature, even the conventional ones, it's really hard to distinguish because of problem two, which is the urban environment. So now we get into the urban environment. You take that one problem and put it into the urban environment. And so the way I think about it is, there are three attributes that make it a wicked problem in an urban environment, specifically for air and space-based sensing, targeting, and kinetics. So the three attributes of an urban environment that make this a hard problem: number one, it's high clutter. Number two, you have high vertical obstructions. And number three, you have a high population density. So let's break that down. The first one, high clutter. So when you walk around, and you're in DC, you walk around DC, next time you go out and about, look around: the street lights, the trash cans, phone booths in some countries, little things like bus stops, vehicles parked on the side of the road, vehicles moving, power lines. All of those things contribute to a cluttered environment. It's not a field in Afghanistan, for instance. The second one is the high vertical obstruction. So think multi-story buildings that are in close proximity create tons of sensor shadows and line of sight obstructions. And so that requires a more direct look down or an indirect sensing technology to monitor those blind spots. And then the last one, which is really, it's about people, it's the high population density. So based on some research that I did, Gaza has about almost 7,000 people per square kilometer. And so when you look at that, again, in the Western world, we try to compare that. That's a higher population density than Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Miami, or San Francisco. And so when we're talking about Hamas, which is operating within the Palestinian population, inside that population density, it becomes a wicked problem.
Well, that leads me to my second question, and take this wherever you like, but you talked about some of the challenges that's really interesting, particularly about the sensors, but that raises the issue that this isn't just a solo effort. Like, it's not just a fighter jet looking down or sensor looking down. So can maybe you describe how manned fighters work in sync with other assets to perform this mission, that of trying to find the rocket launchers on the ground before they're able to launch the rockets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it depends on what phase that we're trying to approach the problem as. So in terms of the active defense is what I would say the Iron Dome is. But really, there's two other phases as you move left. There's a rapid reaction, and then there's a preemptive strikes. And so those are kind of the three bins that I would break down the mission area for this particular problem set. So you have Iron Dome is your last line of defense, and that's your active defense. So it's a missile shooting down a rocket. I think everyone's pretty familiar with that based on the news, so we won't even talk about that. Instead, we'll talk about two things that are a little bit lesser known. So the first one is rapid reaction. So once the rocket is fired, how do you find the shooter? And how do you find the shooter as soon as possible? And so there's a few things that you can use to do that. The first one, no surprise, is drones or RPAs. They could be small, they could be large, as long as it can loiter. Again, going back to my urban environment discussion, there's a lot of blind spots. So having a lot of them overhead looking down, and some of it is luck of the draw. So you have an EO or an IR signature on a known or a suspected area. You see a congregation of people and you build a pattern of life, which I'll talk more about that in a minute. Or you're using the cross cue from signals intelligence onto the drone or emissions intelligence. So the difference is signals intelligence is you can hear what people are saying. So you're picking up the communications and translating it. Or the emissions intelligence, you don't need to hear what they're saying, but you know what kind of equipment they're using, and you can direction find the point of origin of the signal. And so you can collectively use that to kind of build your awareness of what's going on. The other one is space-based sensors. So think a large swath IR detection of the rocket plumes themselves go off. So most of those are detectable from orbit. And then and lastly, most people I don't think really are familiar with this, but the reason why they're able to do the airstrikes is typically from ground-based weapon locating radar. So these are radars that reverse calculate the trajectories, and they actually see they're cued based on the same system as Iron Dome is used to fire the missile to intercept. But these radars actually do reverse calculations. So they figure out where the rocket fired from. And this works for rockets, mortars, and artillery, anything that's ballistic. The U.S. Army, we use these extensively in Afghanistan when they would attack our forward operating bases. We could tell within 5 seconds of where that mortar was launched from. We could cross cue an airborne platform, find someone, and have reasonable certainty based on them being in the area at that time, guilt by association, and then we would track that person and see where they went, and then actually build a targeting list from there. So those are called counter battery radars. So the Army has them all. Most armies and most nations have them. Israel has them as well. They have a few different models, and I can't remember what they are right now, but I know they've operated them for about 20 or 30 years. And that's really what's likely feeding those alert aircraft launchers and those retaliatory airstrikes that you see on TV. So that's the rapid reaction. Any questions on that?
No, that was a perfect explanation.
All right. And then the last one is what I would call preemptive targeting. So how do we target the people before they shoot the rockets? Because really, this is a conflict about people. It's not about equipment. And so finding the people before they can launch their attack, it's very nuanced, and it's nothing is 100%. And so one of the things you can do is you can use historic intelligence. So if we have, if you took 10,000 rocket launches and they're the top 3 point of origins or happen all the time, you would have a sensor soak, and you could see if there's people congregating at those point of origins. And then you could cross cue that. And as you build a pattern of life from that point of origin, you can start to see, hey, there's 10 people congregating, there's 15 people congregating. Okay, now I see someone carrying what looks like a steel tripod. Now I see someone carrying a long tube-shaped thing on their shoulder. And so you could start building a reasonable certainty to preemptively target. We saw this in Afghanistan. We did it quite a bit. And I just want to foot stomp that this is probably while it's the safest on one side of the equation, it's also the most dangerous on the other side of the equation. So nothing is 100%, nothing is free. So you're trading one risk for another. And so, like I said, we saw it in the Middle East and the US. You probably saw a few stories over the years where one in particular where we had airstrikes against a funeral procession, because again, the signatures look very, very common. And so there's a legal gray area, and each country interprets it a little bit different. But at the end of the day, it's about where you accept the risk and that uncertainty based on the threat that you have.
Yeah, that gray area is sort of where I wanted to take this next. It's like, I know you spent time in Afghanistan. I know you spent time with Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the war against ISIS. And I think, well, both of them were a little bit different, but particularly with the war against ISIS, that was, at least on the U.S. side, a return to targeting and the challenges of operating in an urban environment. So perhaps we could dive into that experience and the challenges inherent to modern combat, where it's not necessarily high-end systems, right, that we're trying to challenge here, as was the case with Gaza. Like you're describing these sort of very intricate systems, these very high-end sensors that are literally trying to track, Hamas put out a video that they were able to refashion these rockets out of, I believe, used water pipes that they were digging up out of the ground, right?
Yeah. So
like, it's definitely the cost curve is definitely on their side on this. But it's the crude systems that challenge modern and high-end weapons and modern and high-end sensors. And, just talking a little bit about this theme, about where we're going, at least in modern combat, both in the urban environment and the challenges inherent to sort of, I call them craptastic weapons against sort of these exquisite things that we built to challenge the Soviets and then ultimately repurposed to go after insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Okay. Wow. That's all right. So that's a ton to unpack with modern warfare. And really, you're talking a little bit about the changing character of war. What I will say that anytime that people, it's really easy to get into this kind of topic. It's been very popular the past couple of years. But I think anytime you get into this conversation, you have to be very, very careful about making generalizations or sweeping assertions that actually can help. And it really doesn't help us understand the situation we're talking about. And it kind of muddies the water a little bit. So to kind of help reframe that just a little bit, I'll kind of put it back on you. And so I don't know if you're a fan of Sun Tzu, but there's one of the things that he said that I've kind of picked up along the way that has kind of stuck with me. It's about the 6 different types of terrain. Have you ever heard this before?
Explain it to me.
All right. So there's 6 types of terrain, according to the Sun Tzu, the Art of War. There's accessible ground. There's entangling ground, temporizing ground, narrow passes, the high ground, what he calls precipitous heights. And then lastly, there's positions at great distance from the enemy. And there's no nice word the way that he says it. So of those 6 types, now I'm not going to talk about what each one of those mean. But at the end of the day, most nations that have standing military forces throughout history, they're designed to operate all along that spectrum. And so in some ways, when you field a force that has to do all of those things, from a nation's perspective, everything that you do is a compromise. And in that spectrum, they also have an entire spectrum of reasons they want to go to war, whether it's fear, honor, or interest. And so that's kind of from the nation perspective. Now you flip the script and we're talking about a non-state actor has a very, very specific agenda with a very, very small geographic area. They can actually focus on 1 or 2 types of those terrains, and they can actually do a lot of damage with very, very limited means because they don't have the problem of a nation state. And so the perspectives are entirely different. So I just want to be very clear that we're talking about like apples to orangutans a little bit, right? Of how do you put those 2 together? There's an analogy, and I can't remember who actually said it, but it's like 2 people coming to play chess against each other. and one person has to play all the squares on the chessboard, all the pieces, and the other person is playing an entire game of chess inside a single square on the chessboard. And the problem is the guy that's playing chess on the whole board doesn't realize that the other person is playing an entire game just on one square of the board, because that's the only square he cares about.
Right. Maybe I'll let you go with this last question, but is that these non-state actors, operating in those condensed environments, whether it be Mosul, whether it be Gaza, they too have adapted to the abilities of our sensors. They've kind of figured some stuff out themselves through watching, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about those challenges to when the adversary, even a crude and relatively simple one, and I'm using air quotes, people can't see it, can challenge that targeting and sensing efforts that you were talking about at the top of the show, and perhaps how that puts pressure on modern militaries to try and interdict these things, or at least target these things before they were able to fire at our forces.
That is a cat and mouse game that's been going on forever. Whether it's the sword to the bow and arrow, and the next tranche of technologies that are focused on the urban environment kind of get after that. And we haven't, the U.S. in particular, we haven't spent a lot of time focused on urban warfare in the past 20 years because we haven't had to. We operated mostly via proxy in Inherent Resolve in Iraq and in Syria. But as we kind of pivot back into where in the future, people are going to tend to congregate towards urban areas. So that was the trend before COVID, I would say. If you look at future forecasting and trends analysis for national security, most of the population centers were going to gravitate towards places of where food and trade and water is abundant, which is usually the population hubs that we have today. Remains to be seen how that changes in the post-COVID world. That people are more conscious about pandemics and spreading of viruses. But I would say that at the end of the day, when we're put in a situation where the one side has to enter a entangled terrain, or the accessible ground, as Sun Tzu would call it, that's easy. It's easy to defend. You're going to have you're going to be offsetting your technologies, and so you'll see a lot of things about autonomy. So instead of people going in to clear rooms, we can send devices in that could scan the rooms. There's devices that should be fielding very soon that can see through walls, and so we can actually see what's on the other side of walls. The things that you see in movies the past 10 years that's kind of CGI. A lot of that stuff is there's a lot of technological efforts to mature and field that, because at the end of the day, it's about the technology mouse game. It's about the people behind it. And so how do I not incur more risk as my advantages get offset? So that's kind of what I see as kind of the trends for urban warfare. Does that make sense?
It does. Any last thoughts before we sign off here?
No, happy to be here, and looking forward to some feedback. And if you guys want me back on, let me know and pick a topic and we'll talk about it.
We'll do. And Mike, thanks for coming on and explaining some of the challenges about getting these things before the Israelis or an allied force or partner force has to use something like Iron Dome. So I appreciate you widening the aperture for our listeners. So with that, thanks for coming on, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.